January 1940. Dawn breaks slowly over Europe. Steel tracks sit frozen beneath a pale sky. Engines idle in the cold, their low vibration cutting through the silence. On maps spread across command tables, red arrows point west, east, south. Conflict lines drawn by men who believe momentum itself is a weapon. Across the continent, the German war machine is already moving. Its armies are trained, disciplined, synchronized. Its doctrine is speed, shock, relentless pressure. Cities fall in days. Armies collapse in weeks, too many watching from across borders and oceans. It appears unstoppable, a force built not just of soldiers and tanks, but of certainty. Certainty that preparation has been perfect. Certainty that resistance will shatter on impact. Yet beneath the roar of engines and the rhythm of marching boots, something quieter is beginning to form. Not a single battle, not a single decision, but a slow accumulation of strain. Factories that must run without pause. Supply lines stretched farther each month. Men asked to advance again, and again, and again. The machine does not break in one moment. It grinds forward until the grinding itself becomes the weakness. And the world is about to learn that even the strongest engines fail, not from one blow but from money. In the years leading up to the Second World War, Germany did not prepare for a long struggle. It prepared for a sequence of short, decisive shocks. The trauma of the First World War still shaped every calculation. Blockade, attrition, and exhaustion had brought the German Empire to collapse in 1918. When the Nazi regime began rearming in the 1930s, it was determined never to fight that kind of war again. The solution was speed: political, military, and psychological. German rearmament accelerated after 1933. By the late 1930s, the Wehrmacht had been reorganized around combat arms formations, designed to move fast and strike deep. Tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and air power were meant to function as one system. The Luftwaffe would paralyze communications and morale. Armored spearheads would punch through weak points. Infantry would follow, consolidating gains before an enemy could recover. T's concept, later labeled Blitzkrieg, was not a single doctrine written in stone, but a practical response to Germany's limits. The country lacked the raw materials, oil reserves, and industrial depth for a drawn-out global conflict. Victory had to come before those shortages mattered. In September 1939, the theory was tested. Poland fell in just over 4 weeks. German armor moved faster than expected. Polish command structures fractured under air attack. The campaign appeared to confirm everything German planners believed. Speed worked, shock worked. The war could be controlled. Then came the West. In May 1940, German forces struck through the Low Countries and France. Allied commanders prepared for a repeat of the First World War, a slow, grinding contests along fixed lines. Instead, German armored columns pushed through the Ardennes, a region considered unsuitable for large tank formations. Within days, Allied armies were cut off. Communications failed. Retreats turned chaotic. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The psychological impact was immense. Britain stood alone in Western Europe. Across the Atlantic, observers in the United States studied the campaigns with a mixture of fear and admiration. German officers were praised as innovators. Their army was described as modern, flexible, and superior. But appearances concealed structural fragility. Germany had mobilized for victory, not sustainability. Much of its transport still relied on horses. Ammunition production was efficient, but not limitless. Fuel stocks were thin. The Luftwaffe, so decisive in early campaigns, lacked long-range bombers and the capacity for prolonged strategic warfare. None of this mattered. In 1941, Germany expanded the war again. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a front that stretched thousands of kilometers. It was the largest military operation in history. Once more, the opening months seemed to vindicate German confidence. Entire Soviet armies were in. Millions of prisoners were taken. The German advance raced eastward. But now the machine was no longer fighting one campaign at a time. It was fighting geography, climate, and scale. Each kilometer forward lengthened supply lines. Each destroyed bridge delayed fuel and ammunition. Each winter night exposed the limits of planning built on speed rather than endurance. By the end of 1941, Germany was at war with Britain, the Soviet Union, and soon the United States. The conflict had become global. The tempo that once brought victory now demanded constant expansion, constant success, without pause. And the machine, for the first time, began to feel the weight of its own momentum. By late 1941, the war had outgrown Germany's original design. What began as a series of rapid, controlled campaigns was now a vast, interconnected struggle stretching from the Arctic Circle to North Africa, from the Atlantic Ocean to the outskirts of Moscow. The German war machine was still powerful, but it was no longer operating in isolation. It was being tested simultaneously on multiple fronts against enemies with very different strengths. In the East, the Soviet Union refused to collapse. The initial shock of invasion had been devastating. Entire Soviet formations had disintegrated in the summer and autumn of 1941. Yet behind the front lines, something extraordinary was happening. Factories were dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains. Production resumed under brutal conditions. Tanks, aircraft, and artillery began to appear in numbers that German intelligence had not predicted. German commanders had assumed that the Soviet state would fracture under pressure. Instead, it absorbed punishment and adapted. The war in the East became one of space and attrition, exactly the kind of conflict Germany had hoped to avoid. Winter arrived early and violently. Vehicles froze. Lubricants failed. Soldiers lacked adequate clothing. Equipment designed for fast campaigns broke down under sustained use. German units held ground through discipline and improvisation, but each month cost more than the last. In the West, Britain survived. The Battle of Britain had revealed limits in German air power. The Luftwaffe could not force Britain out of the war. British ports remained open. Supply routes across the Atlantic continued to function. The island became a platform, one that would grow stronger rather than weaker as time passed. At sea, the Atlantic became a battleground of logistics rather than territory. German U-boats inflicted heavy losses on Allied shipping, but they could not sever the flow entirely. The ocean was vast, and the Allies, particularly Britain and later the United States, possessed the shipyards to replace losses faster than submarines could sink them. Then, in December 1941, the war truly became global. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the conflict. Within days, Germany declared war on America. What followed was not an immediate battlefield confrontation, but an industrial one. The United States mobilized on a scale unmatched in history. Factories that had once produced cars and appliances were converted to tanks, aircraft, and ships. Training camps expanded across the continent. Supply chains stretched across oceans. The balance of potential power shifted. Germany still held vast territories. Its armies remained experienced and dangerous, but it now faced opponents whose strength lay not in speed, but in capacity to replace losses, to learn, and to fight continuously. North Africa added another drain. Hegemon forces sent to support Italian allies fought effectively under harsh conditions, but every tank shipped to Africa was a tank not available elsewhere. Every aircraft deployed south was an aircraft missing over Europe or the Eastern Front. The war was no longer about decisive blows. It was about sustaining effort. Germany's leadership responded by demanding more longer hours, stricter control, harsher discipline. Industry was pushed harder. Soldiers were rotated less frequently. Strategic decisions became increasingly centralized, less flexibly. What had once been a finely tuned instrument of motion was becoming a system under permanent strain. And as the pressure built across continents and years, the conflict began to turn from a contest of maneuver into a test of endurance. Germany was never designed to win. That endurance would be tested from every angle. The German war machine was powered by people long before it was powered by steel. In the early years, German soldiers were among the best trained in the world. They moved with confidence, supported by doctrine that rewarded initiative and coordination. Victories reinforced belief not just in leadership, but in inevitability. Many soldiers truly believed the war would be decided before exhaustion ever mattered. But modern war does not consume armies evenly. It consumes them steadily. As the fronts multiplied, German divisions were stretched thinner. Veterans were lost faster than they could be replaced. New recruits arrived younger, less trained, rushed through shortened programs, and sent directly into combat. The cohesion that had once defined German units began to erode not through collapse, but through attrition. Meanwhile, the Allies fought a different kind of human war. Britain, the Soviet Union, and later the United States drew on deeper pools of manpower. Losses were terrible, but replacement was possible. Units could be rebuilt. Rotations, though imperfect, existed. German soldiers increasingly fought without relief. Campaigns that were meant to last weeks dragged into years. Fatigue became permanent. Morale shifted from confidence to endurance. The war machine still moved, but it was being asked to move on worn human parts. And humans, unlike machines, cannot be endlessly overclocked without consequences. Behind every tank at the front stood a factory far from it. Germany entered the war with an advanced industrial base, but one optimized for precision, not volume. German manufacturing emphasized quality engineering, complex designs, and skilled labor. Early in the war, this produced excellent weapons, but excellence came at a cost. As the conflict expanded, the Allies reframed the war as an industrial contest. Quantity became a weapon. Factories were standardized. Designs were simplified. Production lines were scaled relentlessly. In the United States, assembly line logic was applied to warfare itself. Aircraft rolled out by the tens of thousands. Ships were launched faster than they could be sunk. In the Soviet Union, factories operated under brutal conditions, producing vast numbers of tanks that emphasized ruggedness and ease of repair. Germany struggled to adapt. Bombing disrupted production. Skilled workers were lost to the front. Raw materials, especially oil, became increasingly scarce. Attempts to centralize and rationalize industry came late and under constant pressure. Each destroyed German vehicle now represented something harder to replace. Each Allied loss became a temporary setback. The war machine could still strike hard, but it was being outproduced day by day, ton by ton. German success had always depended on synchronization. Tanks, aircraft, radios, and artillery worked together in ways that few armies had mastered in 1939. Early technological advantages multiplied battlefield effectiveness. Radios in armored vehicles allowed rapid coordination. Air-ground cooperation turned breakthroughs into collapses. But technological advantage is not permanent. As the war continued, the Allies learned quickly. They copied what worked. They improved what failed. Radar expanded air defense. Code-breaking exposed operational plans. Aircraft gained range, armor, and reliability. Tanks became simpler, tougher, and easier to maintain. Germany responded with innovation, but innovation alone could not solve systemic pressure. New weapons were often complex, resource-intensive, and difficult to deploy at scale. Fuel shortages limited training and operations. Maintenance became a constant challenge. Technology that once enabled speed now demanded care the system could no longer afford. The machine was still advanced, but it was no longer ahead. And while Germany refined tools for decisive moments, the Allies refined tools for permanence. Those differences would soon extend beyond hardware to the minds making decisions. Early German victories were driven not only by technology and training, but by command culture. Field commanders were encouraged to exploit opportunities, adapt quickly, and act on initiative. Speed depended on trust that officers on the ground could make decisions faster than distant headquarters. As the war expanded, that trust narrowed. Losses mounted. Fronts multiplied. Strategic pressure intensified. Decision-making increasingly shifted upward. Orders became more detailed, less flexibly. Field commanders found themselves constrained by directives that prioritized holding ground over maneuver. At the highest level, strategic judgment hardened into certainty. Warnings from generals were dismissed. Operational pauses were denied. Retreats became politically unacceptable, even when militarily necessary. The war machine was no longer allowed to adjust. Its pace it was ordered to keep moving, regardless of condition. In contrast, Allied command structures evolved toward coordination rather than control. These agreements existed, but systems emerged to integrate air, land, and sea power. Lessons were absorbed, sometimes painfully, then applied. German leadership grew reactive. Allied leadership grew adaptive. The machine still functioned, but its steering was increasingly locked from inside Germany. The pressure was not immediately visible as defeat. Early on, setbacks were explained as temporary. Frontline resilience was emphasized. New weapons were promised. Maps still showed vast territories under German control. The narrative was one of endurance rather than reversal. But soldiers at the front sensed the change first. Enemy forces no longer collapsed as they once had. Attacks were met with layered defenses. Air superiority was contested, then lost. Supply shortages became routine. Allied artillery and air power grew heavier, more precise, more relentless. The enemy had learned how Germany fought and adjusted accordingly. What once felt like domination began to feel like resistance under siege. The war machine found itself fighting opponents who expected its methods, absorbed its blows, and responded in kind. The advantage of surprise was gone. The advantage of tempo followed. Wars are not sustained by equipment alone. They are sustained by belief. In the early years, belief in victory had been genuine. Success reinforced faith in leadership, doctrine, and destiny. Soldiers endured hardship because it felt temporary, because the end seemed near. As years passed, belief thinned. Casualty lists lengthened. Leaves were delayed or cancelled. Letters from home spoke of bombed cities and shortages. The war was no longer something happening. Far away was everywhere. Fear changed character. It became constant rather than sharp. Not panic, but exhaustion. Not collapse, but numb. Among the Allies, belief moved in the opposite direction. Early defeats hardened resolve. Survival became proof that victory was possible. Each successful operation reinforced momentum. Morale does not break suddenly. It erodes. And as belief faded, the German war machine continued to operate, but now under its own weight. Driven more by obligation than conviction. The pressure from every angle, human, industrial, technological, strategic, psychological, was converging. Soon, that pressure would no longer bend the system. It would break it. By 1942, the war had reached a point where momentum alone could no longer carry Germany forward. On every front, the rhythm of conflict began to change. Operations grew larger, slower, and more destructive. Victories, when they came, demanded immense effort. Defeats, when they arrived, could no longer be contained. In the East, the summer offensive of 1942 pushed toward the Volga and the Caucasus. Oil was the objective. German planners knew that fuel shortages were becoming critical. The solution, once again, was advance, but the distances were vast. Forces were divided. The front stretched thin across open terrain and ruined cities. As German units moved deeper, their supply lines frayed under constant attack. By autumn, fighting concentrated around a single name that would come to symbolize the turning of the war. Stalingrad. The city was not just a military objective. It was a logistical hub, a symbolic target, and a political fixation. Street by street, building by building, the battle consumed men and material at an unprecedented rate. Units rotated through ruins that offered no shelter from artillery or winter. The German advance slowed, then stalled. While the battle raged in the city, Soviet forces massed on the flanks. They struck where German allies held the units, less equipped, less mobile, and when the encirclement closed, an entire German army was trapped. Attempts to supply it by air failed. Weather, distance, and Allied pressure made sustained resupply impossible. Promises of relief went unfulfilled. The war machine, built on movement, found itself immobilized. In North Africa, a parallel pattern unfolded. German and Allied forces fought across deserts, where logistics determined survival. Early German successes could not be sustained without secure supply routes. As Allied control of the sea and air improved, German forces found themselves fighting uphill against shortages they could not solve on the battlefield. At sea, the Atlantic shifted. New escort tactics, improved radar, and mass production of ships reduced the effectiveness of German submarines. Losses mounted, the balance tilted. In the air, Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Cities burned. Factories were disrupted. The German economy was forced into constant recovery rather than expansion. Air superiority, once contested, increasingly belonged to the Allies. None of these developments alone decided the war, but together they changed its nature. Germany was no longer dictating events. It was reacting, committing reserves to crises that multiplied faster than they could be resolved. The machine was still dangerous, still capable of violence on a vast scale. But it was losing its ability to choose where and when that violence would be applied. The turning point was not a single moment. It was the realization across fronts, across commands, that the war had slipped beyond control. And the consequences of that realization were about to become irreversible. After Stalingrad, the German war machine no longer moved with confidence. It moved with urgency. The destruction of an entire field army was more than a battlefield loss. It shattered the assumption that defeat could always be reversed by willpower and speed. From that point forward, every major German operation carried the weight of recovery rather than expansion. In 1943, the attempt to regain initiative came at Kursk. It was planned as a decisive counterstroke, a carefully prepared offensive designed to eliminate a bulge in the front and restore momentum. But the conditions that had once made German offensives successful no longer existed. Surprise was gone. Soviet defenses were layered, mined, and reinforced in depth. German units faced defenses designed specifically to absorb and blunt armored assaults. When the attack began, it met prepared resistance instead of collapse. Losses mounted quickly. Tanks that once spearheaded breakthroughs were now met by massed anti-tank fire and relentless artillery. The offensive stalled, then ended. From that moment, the initiative in the East passed permanently to the Soviet Union. In the West, Allied air power tightened its grip. Bombing raids expanded in scale and frequency. Oil facilities became primary targets. Synthetic fuel plants were hit again and again. The effects were not always immediate, but they were cumulative. Training flights were reduced. Operational movement became riskier. Armored units waited for fuel that never arrived in sufficient quantities. In June 1944, pressure arrived from the West in physical form. Allied forces landed in Normandy. The operation was not just an invasion, it was a logistical achievement unmatched in history. Men, vehicles, and supplies flowed across the Channel in quantities Germany could not disrupt. Attempts to throw the Allies back failed under overwhelming air and artillery support. German units fought hard, often with skill and determination, but they fought under skies they did not control, with fuel they could not replace, and reserves that arrived too late or not at all. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy, the pattern repeated. German counterattacks were launched without adequate preparation or supply. Losses could not be replaced. Retreats turned into withdrawals under pressure, then into collapses of coordination. By late 1944, Germany faced assault from both east and west. Cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks were shattered. Command structures strained under constant crises. The war machine had not stopped functioning, but it had lost coherence. It no longer advanced. It reacted. It defended. It improvised. And each improvisation consumed resources that no longer existed in sufficient quantity. The final phase of the war would not be decided by sudden collapse, but by the slow, grinding realization that the system itself had been exhausted. The machine was still running, but it was running out. When the German war machine finally began to give way, it did not do so quietly. The retreat across Europe was marked by destruction on a scale rarely seen before. Cities that had once served as industrial hubs, rail junctions, and command centers lay in ruins. Bridges were demolished, rail lines twisted and broken, roads were cratered under constant air attack. On the battlefield, the cost was visible in numbers. Millions of German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Entire formations ceased to exist. Equipment losses mounted beyond replacement tanks, abandoned for lack of fuel, aircraft grounded permanently, artillery destroyed or left behind in retreat. On the Eastern Front, Soviet advances rolled westward with overwhelming force. German defenses, once flexible and mobile, hardened into static lines that could not absorb sustained pressure. Each attempted stand consumed men and material that could not be replenished. In the West, Allied armies pushed steadily toward the German heartland. Air superiority ensured that movement by day was nearly impossible. Supply convoys were attacked relentlessly. German units often arrived at the front, under strength, undersupplied, and already exhausted. Civilian populations paid a parallel price. Strategic bombing devastated urban centers. Housing collapsed, food shortages intensified. Displacement became constant. The war that had once been sold as distant and controlled now reached into every household. Official reports reflected the strain. Production targets were missed. Fuel allocations were cut repeatedly. Training standards were reduced to compensate for shortages of time and resources. New formations existed more on paper than in reality, yet the system continued to demand sacrifice. Orders were issued for last-ditch defenses. Improvised units were formed from remaining personnel. The language of command shifted from strategy to survival. The German war machine had been built to win quickly. It was now fighting simply to continue. And as Allied forces crossed into Germany itself, the consequences of years of attrition became impossible to deny, not just militarily, but socially and psychologically. The aftermath was no longer confined to the front lines. It was everywhere. As Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory, the true cost of prolonged strain became unmistakable. What they encountered was not a single collapsing front, but a society exhausted by total war. Transportation networks barely functioned. Fuel reserves were nearly non-existent. Communications broke down under constant bombardment. Orders took longer to arrive. They arrived at all. Military cohesion weakened in stages. Some units fought to the end with discipline and professionalism. Others dissolved under pressure, surrendering when resistance no longer seemed meaningful. Desertion increased, not from cowardice, but from exhaustion and disillusionment. The promise of victory that had once sustained sacrifice was gone. Industrial output, despite heroic efforts, could no longer meet demands. Allied bombing had forced factories underground, dispersed production, and disrupted supply chains. Even when weapons were produced, they often lacked trained crews, fuel, or ammunition. Reports from the period describe armored vehicles delivered without engines, aircraft completed without sufficient pilots, infantry units issued rifles but no transportation. The machine continued to produce components, but it could no longer assemble them into a functioning whole. On the battlefield, Allied numerical and material superiority became overwhelming. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly from the east, absorbing losses but replacing them continuously. Western Allied forces advanced with coordinated air, armor, and infantry support that Germany could no longer counter effectively. The collapse, when it came, was administrative as much as military. Local commanders acted independently. Regional authorities made decisions without coordination. Central control weakened under the weight of simultaneous crises. The system fractured not because individuals failed, but because the structure could no longer carry the load placed upon it. When fighting finally ceased in Europe in May 1945, the German war machine had not been destroyed by a single decisive strike. It had been dismantled piece by piece. Through sustained pressure, through endurance, through imbalance of resources and time, the aftermath revealed a lesson written across ruins and records alike. Modern warfare is not won solely by brilliance or speed, but by the ability to sustain effort longer than the enemy. And that lesson would echo far beyond the war itself. The German war machine did not fail because it lacked skill, courage, or innovation. It failed because it was built for a war that did not last as long as the world demanded. In the opening years, speed had been decisive. Coordination had been revolutionary. Confidence had carried armies across borders faster than anyone believed possible. But modern war does not reward early brilliance forever. It tests systems over time, testing logistics, leadership, industry, and belief until only what can endure remains. The Allies did not break the machine in a single battle. They pressed it from every direction. For years, they forced it to fight in deserts and cities, in skies and oceans, in summers of dust and winters of ice. They matched innovation with production, courage with replacement, sacrifice with scale. Each loss was answered, each setback absorbed. What finally ended the machine was not defeat alone, but imbalance. An imbalance of fuel, of manpower, of factories, of time. Germany's armies continued to fight, even when the system that sustained them had already failed. That persistence gave the war its final, tragic cost, but it could not reverse exhaustion that had been accumulating since the first victories. The lesson left behind is quiet but enduring. Wars are not won by momentum alone. They are won by structures that can survive friction, loss, and delay. The German war machine was powerful. It was varied, it reshaped warfare. But in the end, it was broken not by one blow but by many, applied patiently, relentlessly, and together. And that, more than any single battle, is how the Allies slowly broke it.